The dungeon smelled like whetstone and old decisions. Mara had learned to breathe through her mouth on the lower levels. She had been doing it for 6 years, and by now it was automatic, a small adjustment her body made without any instruction from her mind, the way you stop noticing the sound of a clock that has always been in the room. She moved quickly through the corridor, her bucket swinging at her side, water sloshing against the rim. The torch ahead had burned too low. She would have to report it. She would not report it. The guards who sat at the end of this corridor looked at her the way they looked at all the things in the dungeon that were there to be used and not considered, and reporting a dead torch meant speaking to one of them, which meant standing in front of that particular kind of attention, which she had learned to avoid the way you learn to avoid the place in a floorboard that makes noise. She was very good at being invisible. She had been practicing since she was 9 years old. The cell at the end of the third row held a man named Owen. He had been there 11 months. She knew this because she had been counting, not from sentiment but because she kept a list inside her head, and keeping a list meant keeping track, and keeping track was the closest thing she had to a purpose in this place beyond the bucket and the bread and the cloth she used to wipe down the corridors on alternating days. Owen, third row, lower level, left side. Middle-aged, had stopped asking questions after the third month, which was when most of them stopped asking questions. Before Owen there had been a woman named Clara, who had lasted only 3 weeks before something inside her gave way in a manner that had nothing to do with the body. Before Clara there had been a young man whose name Mara never learned because he never spoke, not once, not in all the months she pushed his cup through the slot and heard him take it. She had kept him on the list anyway, as a description, young man, quiet, picked at the mortar between the stones with his fingers until they bled. Then he was not there anymore, and she moved the description to the other list, the one she kept alongside the first, of the ones who were gone. She set her bucket outside Owen's cell. She pushed the water cup through the slot. She heard him move. He moved slowly now, the way everyone moved after the first few months, as if the dungeoneer had actual physical weight and they were learning to carry it. She heard him pick up the cup. She moved on. At the end of the south corridor there was an iron bracket bolted into the wall at shoulder height. It was a heavy, old, smoke-blackened thing, and she had been polishing it for 4 years, ever since a particular evening when she had been frightened in the directionless way, without any specific object, just a general pressure behind the eyes and tightness in the hands, and had found that the motion of polishing steadied her. She came back to it whenever she needed steadying. The bracket never got cleaner. It was the same exact shade of dull black it had always been and probably always would be. But her hands stopped shaking when she worked at it, and that was the whole point. She had her cloth out now. She was polishing the bracket when she heard the footsteps. Light footsteps. Careful ones, the kind that belong to someone who knows how to move through a building without being noticed by it. Not the heavy-booted rhythm of the guards, which she could identify from 2 levels above. These were someone else's footsteps, belonging to someone who was choosing their own weight with every step. She did not stop polishing. She kept the cloth moving in slow even circles and waited. The woman who came around the corner was perhaps 50 years old, small in the way that some people are small because they have decided exactly how much space they need and have stopped occupying any more than that. She wore grey, the same shade as the dungeon stone walls, and her silver-white hair was pinned back with what looked like a piece of dark wood. She had very still eyes. Not the stillness of someone at peace, but the stillness of someone who has already arrived at a decision and no longer needs to move toward it. She looked at Mara. Mara looked back. "You are the unbound girl," the woman said. Not an insult, not an apology. A fact being checked against a list. "I work here," Mara said. "I know what you do." The woman tilted her head slightly to one side. "I have been watching this dungeon for a long time. Not the building. The people in it and the people who move through it. I know which guards are decent and which ones are not. I know which prisoners still have themselves and which ones have started to lose that. I know that you keep a list of their names. I know that you remember them when no one else does." Mara put the cloth in her pocket. The woman reached into the pocket of her grey dress and produced something small. She held it out on her open palm. A piece of iron thread, thin as a single hair, perhaps 4 inches long. It caught the torchlight in a way that thread should not catch light, as if the light had recognized it and stopped to look. "My name is Seraphine," the woman said. That name settled onto the air differently than names usually do. Mara had heard it before. Most people in this kingdom had heard it, the way you hear the names of hard winters or rivers that flood badly or things you are told not to approach. Seraphine the border witch. The woman who lived at the edge of the king's territory where the mapped land ended and the old wild country began. The woman about whom there were multiple kinds of stories, none of which agreed on the details but all of which agreed on one thing: she made bargains. She made them carefully and she kept them entirely, and the people who entered into them rarely understood what they had agreed to until it was already done. Mara gripped the handle of her bucket. "What do you want?" she asked. She was glad her voice came out flat and level. 11 people in this dungeon are going to die here, Seraphine said. Not violently. From time. From being forgotten in a system that has no mechanism for remembering them. They cannot be freed through the gates. The gates are warded against exactly this kind of removal. The guards are loyal, not from love but from the kind of fear that is sturdier than love. There is no bribery that would hold, no tunnel that has not already been discovered and sealed, no visitor access that has not been cancelled as a matter of policy. She closed her fingers lightly around the thread, then opened them again. There is one possible way. Through darkness. The dungeon wards are built to read movement through the geometry of light and shadow. Remove the shadows, disrupt that geometry entirely, and the wards lose their grip on what is moving. The prisoners could move through the cells and corridors without being trapped. They would have one night, perhaps two, to find the passage beneath the east wall before the wards could reset. "And you need something from me to make the darkness," Mara said. "I need an anchor," Seraphine said. "Something that belongs to this place the way only something can belong to a place after years of moving through it. Something the dungeon recognizes. Something that has touched every corridor, every cell, every level, that carries the spatial memory of all of it." She looked at Mara steadily, without apology. "Your shadow has walked every inch of this dungeon for 6 years. It has moved across every stone on every level. It is woven into the place in a way that nothing else is. For this binding, it is what the spell needs as a root." Mara looked down at the floor. Her shadow stretched behind her, long and thin in the torchlight, reaching back toward the south corridor. She had never thought much about it before tonight. You do not usually think about the things that have always been simply there. "What happens to it?" she said. "If you use it as the anchor." Seraphine did not soften what she was about to say. She simply said it, the way you say something you have decided to say directly because indirection would be a kind of disrespect. "I bind it to the dungeon floor permanently. It stays here. You live. You continue to live, to breathe, to move through the world in every normal way. But you will never cast a shadow again. In any light, in any season, for the rest of your life, there will be nothing beneath your feet. You will be, in that particular way, incomplete. Permanently and without remedy." Mara put down her bucket. It made a dull sound on the stone floor. She thought about Owen picking up his water cup in the slow new way he had. She thought about Clara, who had not lasted 3 weeks. She thought about the man who used to sing very softly at night when he thought no one was listening. She thought about the young man with no name who had picked at the mortar between the stones until his fingers bled and then was not there anymore. She thought about herself at 17, standing in a government official's office while the man at the desk wrote the word "unbound" beside her name in the ledger and turned to the next page without once looking at her face. She thought about every door that word had closed, every room it had made smaller, every moment it had placed her specifically on the side of things that did not count. She had been incomplete for a long time already. She had been incomplete in a way that was invisible, which meant it did not count to anyone but her. The shadow would be the part of her incompleteness that everyone could see. That was a trait she could think about seriously. "Tell me everything," she said. "Every part of how it works. Everything that happens to me and everything that could go wrong." Seraphine told her. She took a long time doing it. Mara asked every question she could think of and Seraphine answered each one without evasion and without attempting to make any of it sound smaller than it was. By the time Seraphine had finished, the torch at the far end of the south corridor had burned completely out and they were standing in near darkness, and Mara had run out of questions. She reached out and took the iron thread from Seraphine's palm. It was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the dungeon. It was the code of something that has been decided, that belongs to the category of permanent things, that closes behind you rather than in front of you. Tonight, Mara said. When the second bell rings. Yes, Seraphine said. Mara put the iron thread in her pocket, beside the polishing cloth. She picked up her bucket. There was a moment then, just a moment, between the putting away and the picking up, when she stood in the near dark of the corridor with the iron thread in her pocket and her bucket at her feet and Seraphine watching her with those already decided eyes. A moment where it would have been entirely possible to say no, to put the thread back, to say she had changed her mind or she needed more time or the price was simply too high. She did not say any of those things. She thought about Owen. She thought about the way he moved now, slow and careful, as if the air in his cell had gotten heavier over the months and he was learning to walk through it. She thought about the 11 people on the lower level, all of them moving slowly now, all of them carrying the specific weight of a place that has decided to forget you. She thought about the boy with no name who had picked at the mortar until his fingers bled. She thought about Clara, who had not lasted 3 weeks. She thought about herself at 17. The ledger. The word beside her name. The man who had not looked up. She picked up her bucket. She walked back toward the south corridor to finish the last rounds she would ever do with a shadow following her feet. The last rounds felt different knowing they were the last. She noticed things she had not noticed before, or had noticed and stopped seeing. The way the torchlight on the third row threw long orange shadows across the cell doors. The way the stone floor had been worn smooth in the center of the main corridor from decades of feet, generations of feet, or the people who had come through this place before her. The sound of Owen breathing through his door as she passed. The smell of the corridor at the bottom of the stairs, the particular smell of very old stone and the cold that lives inside it. She walked the whole lower level one last time. She set down her bucket and walked it without the bucket, just walking, her hands at her sides and the torch she was carrying and the shadow at her feet. She walked every corridor. She stood in each junction for a moment. She was not saying goodbye exactly. She was paying attention. She was making sure she had seen all of it, that she knew all of it, that the 6 years were fully in her. She stopped at Owen's cell door. She stood outside it for a moment and listened to him breathe. Slow and even. Not the sleep breathing, just the resting breathing of someone who had learned to rest in the small ways available to them. She did not say anything. He did not know she was there. That was fine. That was exactly right. She walked the full circuit of the lower level and came back to the main junction and stood in the center of it, exactly where she would be standing in a few hours when Seraphine pushed the pin through the iron thread and the dungeon went dark. She stood there and looked down at her shadow lying behind her on the stone floor, the shadow that had moved through this exact junction perhaps 10,000 times over 6 years of rounds. She had done good work here. Not the work of a hero. The work of someone who had shown up, every day, and made the small choices available to them. The water cup through the slot. The names remembered. The bracket polished, useless and steadying. She had done good work and now she was going to do one large impossible piece of work and then she was going to stop bringing water to this dungeon because the people who needed water would be gone. She took a long breath. She let it out. Then she went back to the south corridor. She passed the bracket. She did not reach for her cloth. Her hands were completely steady. The second bell rang through the dungeon like a sound traveling through deep water, lower and slower than it should have been. Mara stood in the junction where the 4 main corridors met on the lower level, the iron thread between her fingers. Seraphine was beside her, already speaking in a language that did not sound like any language Mara had heard before. It sounded like pressure. Like stone being patient. Like the kind of weight that does not need to hurry because it has all the time in the world. Mara looked down at her shadow lying on the floor behind her. Long and thin. Her familiar dark companion, the shape of herself that had followed her through 6 years of morning rounds and evening rounds and all the hours between, through every corridor on every level, across every stone of every cell she had ever opened and cleaned and locked again. She did not say goodbye to it. You do not say goodbye to something that is not living but simply becoming something else. Seraphim pressed the iron thread to the floor of the junction and drove a small pin through it into the stone. The pin was made of something Mara could not name, darker than iron, the exact color of the space between stones. There was no sound. No shaking in the walls. No flash. There was only a feeling, immediate and total, like a seam being removed from a garment, like something that had always been structural but had never been visible until the moment it was gone. Mara looked down. Her feet stood on bare stone. The torchlight fell all around her. Where her shadow should have been, the light continued across the floor uninterrupted, finding nothing where she stood. The dungeon went dark. Not the dark of extinguished torches. The torches still burned. The light they produced was still present, still moving through the air. But it moved differently. Without the hard angles that shadow makes alongside light. Without the geometry that the word system used to track movement. The words were reading empty information. The words were blind. Cell by cell, beginning at the far end of the lower level, the doors released. Not with a bang or a crash. Quietly, the way tension releases in a rope when the thing it was holding against has simply gone. Owen's door shifted first. She heard him stop breathing for a moment. She heard him take one very careful breath. She heard him stand up. She heard him take the first steps he had taken outside that cell in 11 months, slow and deliberate, like someone proving to themselves that the floor is real. She moved back against the wall of the corridor junction and stayed there. This was not her moment in the story. She had had her moment already, and it had been the moment with the iron thread, and this was the part that happened because of that moment, and she did not need to be at the center of it. The father from the third row came out fast. He stopped short. He turned back toward his open cell door. He turned away. He turned back. He did this twice, the motion of someone who cannot yet trust their own good fortune, who needs to check again that the door is really open, that this is really happening. He put his hands flat against his own face for a moment. Then he moved, truly moved, down the corridor at the pace of a man who has someone to get back to. The woman from the second row came out more slowly. She walked with one hand trailing against the wall, barely touching it, the contact of someone saying farewell to the thing that had been her entire world for 14 months. She walked past Mara without looking at her. Mara did not say anything. The woman did not say anything. That was right. One by one they came out of their cells. Some moved quickly, with the energy of people who had been sitting still for so long that motion felt like something they needed to run through before it closed again. Some moved with the careful steps of people relearning the fact that a floor can be trusted, that a corridor with no locked door at the end of it is something that can exist and that they can be in it. One man stopped directly in front of Mara in the middle of the corridor junction and stood there with his eyes closed. Just stood. In the open space. He stood for one full breath, maybe two, and then opened his eyes and walked on without looking at her, and she was glad he had not looked at her because she was not entirely sure what her face was doing. The boy came last. Light quick footsteps, and then he came around the corner and pulled up short when he found her standing there in the junction. He was young, 15 at most, thin in the particular way that months of insufficient food produce, a thinness that carries its own history visibly in the shoulders and the wrists. His hair had grown long during his time below ground and he pushed it back from his face with a gesture that was clearly a habit from before, from a life he had been living when things were normal and he had not yet learned how a cell sounds at night. He looked at her. Then he looked down at his own feet. His shadow lay behind him on the stone, soft in the strange diffuse light of the spell, but present. He looked at Mara's feet. He looked back at his own shadow. He looked up at her face, and the expression he wore was not quite surprise and not quite understanding and not quite grief, but it was all three of those things in a way that had not yet settled into any of them. He stepped forward and gripped her wrist. Firmly. Deliberately. The grip of someone who needs to be understood. You did this, he said. His voice was rough from disuse, the sound of someone remembering how words work. Mara looked at him. She was aware, with complete clarity, that there was nothing below her feet but bare stone. The absence was not painful. It simply was. The shape of something that had been there and was there no longer. Go, she said. You need to reach the east passage before the third bell. He held her wrist for one more moment. Then he let go and he ran. She stood alone in the corridor junction. Every cell on the lower level was empty. Seraphine was gone. The dungeon was quiet in the way that only dungeons can be quiet, which is completely, without apology, without warmth. She took her cloth from her pocket. She walked to the bracket on the south corridor wall and began to polish it. Her hands were steady. The bracket was the same dull black it had always been. She was still polishing it when she heard the heavy footsteps on the upper stairs. Measured, even, unhurried. The walk of someone who has never needed to move quickly because every room they have ever entered has waited for them. Kellen came around the corner and stopped when the torchlight found her. He was taller than his portraits. The portraits made him severe, all careful jaw and controlled eyes, the kind of face designed to communicate authority from a distance. The real version was taller and quieter and more complicated than any portrait had managed, and he was alone, though she could hear the guards on the stairs behind him. He had come down ahead of them. He had felt the change in the dungeon through whatever channel an Alpha King uses to feel the shape of his own territory, and he had come ahead of everyone. He looked at her. He looked at the empty cells. He looked at the torches burning with their strange flat light, the light without hard angles or dark companions. He said, "Where are they?" "Gone," Mara said. He walked toward her at the pace of someone so accustomed to the world accommodating his speed that hurrying would feel like an argument with the nature of things. He stopped 4 feet from her and looked at her the way someone looks at something that does not fit the category they had prepared for it. "You are the woman who brings water," he said. "I work here," she said. 3rd time tonight she had said that sentence. "The wards are down," he said. "Every cell on the lower level is empty. You are standing here at the 3rd bell polishing an iron bracket." He looked at the bracket, then at her. "Why are you polishing the bracket?" "Habit," she said. He studied her for a moment and then he looked down. The torchlight fell across the floor around her feet. Clean light, flat light, the strange textureless light of Seraphine's spell still running through the dungeon. Where her shadow should have been there was only the stone. The light lay uninterrupted past her feet to the wall behind her. He looked at her feet for a long time. She watched his face while he looked. She watched it do something she had not seen a face do before, the particular expression of a man who has just encountered a fact that does not fit inside any existing category. Not anger. Not calculation. Something prior to both of those, something like what a person looks like in the moment they open a door expecting a room and find instead that the building has no back wall, that there is open sky where the stone should have been. His wolf went still. She could not see it. She could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather arrives. The 2 or 3 seconds before something significant happens when everything goes quiet. "You bound your shadow to the floor," he said. She did not confirm it. It was already there, already visible, already simply true between them. "What is your name?" he said. She told him. He said it once, quietly, the way you say something when you are placing it somewhere you will not lose it. "Mara," he said. Behind him, at the top of the stairs, the guards arrived. He turned his head slightly without turning his body. "Take her to the east chamber," he said. The same quiet. Not a cell. The chamber. One of the guards began to say something about standing, about park, about the legal conditions of a person who is unbound in this kingdom, all the words that had followed her for 23 years. "The east chamber," Kellen said, in a tone that was not loud and did not need to be. The guard stopped. They came to stand beside her. She reached for her bucket and one of them took it without comment. She walked up the stairs and did not look back at the corridor junction, at the empty cells, at the torches burning with their strange flat light. She knew what was not behind her on the floor. The east chamber had a window over the north courtyard, a wide ledge, and a crack in the mortar above the glass that let in a draft that smelled of pine trees somewhere to the north. She sat on the ledge and looked out at the dark courtyard, and then she looked at the moonlight coming through the glass and falling across the floor. She put her hand in it. She had known what she would find. She had agreed to this knowing. She had thought about it in the corridor before she took the thread from Seraphine's palm, and she had decided she understood what it meant, and she had been correct about the facts of it, which was not the same as being prepared for the experience of the facts. Her hand lay in the moonlight on the stone floor. No shadow. The light moved around her fingers the way it moves around any object, displaced and redirected. But the floor beneath her hand was simply lit. There was no dark mark of her hand on the stone, no extension of her into that dimension of the world. She moved her hand slowly through the beam. Nothing below it changed. She put her hand in her lap and looked at it there. She would not make shadows anymore. Not in moonlight. Not in torchlight. Not in the low winter sun or the bright summer noon or any light in any season for the rest of her life. She looked at this fact directly, from several angles, making sure she was seeing all of it. Yes. She would do it again. Yes. It was worth it. Yes. She was going to learn to live inside this particular absence the way she had learned to live inside all the other absences that had been part of her life, and she would do it because she did not know any other way to be a person, and she had never found that way lacking. There was a crack in the mortar above the window. She had noticed it the first time she cleaned this room. A thin dark line where two old stones had shifted against each other over the years. Not structural, not dangerous. Simply the mark of a building that had been standing for a very long time and had accepted that years would change it in small ways. The draft that came through it smelled of pine. She decided she liked the smell of pine. She had not had opinions about smells before tonight, but tonight had been full of things she was noticing differently, and probably that was right, probably that was what happened when you made a choice that changed your life permanently. She did not sleep. She sat on the ledge and watched the courtyard go from dark to gray to pale morning. 2 days passed. She watched the courtyard through the window. She counted the cracks in the ceiling. 11. She watched the guard shift changes and noted, not because it mattered but because she noticed things, that the northern post changed 6 minutes before the southern ones, which suggested the schedule was mapped to patrol rounds rather than to a single central clock. Food was brought. She ate and returned to the ledge. She was good at waiting. She had been doing it in one form or another for 6 years. The first day she spent mostly at the window. She watched the courtyard go through its daily rhythms, the deliveries in the morning, the training sessions in the afternoon, the quiet of the early evening when the light changed and the stones took on a different color, more blue than gold, the color of a day ending. She watched all of this from above and thought about the 11 people who had been in the dungeon and were now somewhere else, somewhere with that sky above them and that light on their faces. She hoped the father had reached his daughter. She hoped the woman who had walked touching the wall had found somewhere warm. She hoped the boy was somewhere that had enough food. She thought about whether Kellen had found them. Whether any of them had been caught. She did not know. She had no way of knowing, and there was no point in imagining either outcome. She had done what she could do, which was buy them the darkness and the time. What they did with the time was up to them. The second day she spent partly at the window and partly on the floor, sitting with her back against the wall beneath the window because the ledge got uncomfortable after many hours. She thought about the position Kellen had said he might create. She turned it over and looked at it seriously, not because she was certain he would do it but because it was worth thinking about seriously. Warden of the Unbound. A title that did not yet exist. A role with standing and access and a seat at the edge of the governing table. She thought about all the people who were unbound in this kingdom, all the people like herself and unlike herself, all the various ways that word had shaped itself around individual lives. She thought about what it would mean to have someone whose job it was to go into rooms on their behalf. She thought about whether that person should be her. Yes, she decided. If he offered it, she would say yes. Not because she was certain she was right for it, but because there was no one else who was going to take it, and the work needed to be done, and she was capable of doing it, and those three things together were enough. Food was brought. She ate and returned to the ledge. She was good at waiting. She had been doing it in one form or another for 6 years. On the morning of the third day she heard his footsteps in the corridor. She knew them already. Measured, even, unhurried. The specific gait of a man who had spent his entire adult life in a building that arranged itself around his pace. The door opened. Kellen stood in the doorway. He looked at her on the ledge, her hands in her lap, the crack in the mortar above her, the pale courtyard behind her. "My counsel wants you executed," he said. Flat, factual. A thing he was presenting for her to have. "I know," she said. "The argument is not entirely unreasonable," he said. He came into the room and stopped near the far wall, leaving the space between them open. "You release people whose imprisonment was legally sanctioned. You used, or facilitated the use of, unlicensed magic inside Crown property. You are unbound, which means there is no pact with any political stake in what happens to you, and therefore no cost to removing you." He paused. "By every framework my counsel uses, their position is defensible." "Yes," she said. "You do not seem concerned by this." "I decided I was willing to die before I said yes to the bargain," she said. "It would feel dishonest to become concerned about it now that it is already done and the people who needed to leave have left." He looked at her for a moment. "I am not going to have you executed," he said. She nodded. He came away from the wall and walked to the window. He stood a few feet to her right, looking out at the courtyard instead of at her. The courtyard was less complicated to look at than she was at this particular moment, and she understood that. He looked out at the courtyard for a moment in silence. She looked out at it too. The morning was grey and cold and the people moving across the stones below them were doing so quickly, shoulders drawn up against the chill, their breath visible in the air. She thought about what it must be like to be him in this moment. A king who had presided over this territory for long enough that the territory had shaped itself around his presence. A man whose authority was structural, built into the document and the words and the habits of everyone who worked in this building. And here was a thing that his authority had not covered, had not anticipated, had not had a category for. A woman with no shadow who had decided that the people in his dungeon were worth more than the piece of herself she was spending to help them. She did not know what he had done with that, in the 3 days between the dungeon and this room. She suspected he had sat with it the way she sat with difficult things, slowly, looking at it from different angles, trying to understand it completely before making any decision. He turned away from the window. "I understand why it was done," he said. "The people in question were not the worst of what fills my dungeons. They were people who had made themselves politically inconvenient, and the system absorbed them the way it absorbs inconveniences. They would have died of time." He paused. "I am not saying their imprisonment was just. I am saying I understand the logic of what you did. What I cannot find," he said, "is the part where it was you." She waited. "There are people in this kingdom who have been trying to free those prisoners for years," he said. "People with resources, with access, with plans built over months. People who had far more to work with than you did and who had not taken the step you took." He turned and looked at her directly. "Why were you the one willing to pay that price?" She had been thinking about this question for 3 days. She had turned it over from every angle she could find. She gave him the smallest true piece of it. "I had less to lose," she said. He stood with that. "That is not the whole answer," he said. "No," she said. "But it is the part that fits into words." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked down at her feet, at the morning light coming through the window and falling across the floor, uninterrupted, finding nothing where she should have been. "I am going to create a position," he said. She had not expected this. She kept her face still and listened. "Warden of the Unbound," he said. "There is no precedent for it in this kingdom's legal structure. My counsel will argue about it for months on procedural grounds alone. It will require new language in 3 existing documents and the cooperation of 2 park lords who are going to be very unhappy about what it implies for the legal standing of unbound people generally. Something in his voice suggested that the unhappiness of 2 park lords was an inconvenience he was prepared to endure with complete patience. The position would give you legal standing within the kingdom structure. Park protection by extension of office. A formal role with access to records, to government officials, to the governing table. Not at the head. At the edge. But present and recognized. He looked at her. It would not give you back what you gave. I know, she said. I asked Seraphine, he said. 3 days ago. Whether the binding could be undone. Mara went absolutely still on the window ledge. She replied this morning, he said. She said yes. Under one condition. She looked at him and he looked at her and neither of them said anything for a moment and she already knew from the exact controlled quality of his silence what the condition was, and he already knew from the exact controlled quality of her stillness that she had understood it, and so neither of them said it out loud. Right, she said. Yes, he said. A silence settled between them. Not empty. The kind of silence that has the weight of the thing neither person is saying. Do you want the position? He said. She thought about every name on the list inside her head. She thought about every person like herself she had not yet found because she had not yet had the standing to look for them. She thought about the boy from the dungeon, wherever he was now, and whether there was anyone in this kingdom who would notice if he needed help. Yes, she said. He nodded. He turned toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. He looked back at her. She had no name yet for that look. She would not have one for a long time. But she would remember it as the first time in many years that someone had looked at her with the specific intention of understanding something rather than categorizing it. He left. The door closed. She turned to the window. The courtyard was full of ordinary morning, people moving across the stones with their ordinary shadows. She watched the shadows for a while. Then she got up and found the paper and quill and inkwell that had been left on the table, and she sat down and began to write. Not the list she kept inside her head. A new one. The one she was going to build from here. In the weeks that followed, the work was both larger and smaller than she had anticipated. Larger because the number of unbound people in the capital district alone was far greater than she had estimated, and smaller because most of what they needed was not grand or difficult but simply someone with standing to say their name out loud in a room that mattered. She had a room now. Not the East Chamber, which had been temporary, but a proper room on the 2nd level of the administrative wing, with a door that locked from the inside, which she had never had before. She had a window that looked out over the training yard. She had a table large enough to spread papers across, and a lamp she could adjust without asking anyone's permission. She needed several days to stop treating it like a place she might be asked to leave. She had a seal. A small wax seal pressed with a symbol that meant she had the right to enter certain buildings, to speak in certain rooms, to be heard by officials who would previously have moved her out of their doorways with the same mad effort one uses to move furniture. She used it carefully. She used it the way someone who has never had a tool uses the first real one they are given, slowly, thinking about each use, making sure it counted before she spent it. Petra was the first person she found. 34 years old, working as a laundress for a park household for 9 years without a single day of wages, because the law that required wages for labor had been written by and for park-affiliated workers, and unbound workers existed in the gap it had never bothered to close. The household's park lord had been aware of this gap. He had not constructed it deliberately, exactly, but he had not worked to close it either, which Mara had decided was essentially the same thing. Petra was not angry when Mara found her. She was tired in the particular way of someone who has been fighting the same argument in their own head every day for 9 years and has not yet found anyone willing to fight it beside them in an actual room. She had a quiet, careful way of speaking that Mara recognized immediately, the way you speak when you have learned that speaking too clearly about what is wrong tends to get you removed from the room before you can finish the sentence. Mara took her case to the adjudication panel with the careful language she had spent 3 weeks learning from the documents she had pulled from the administrative archives, documents that laid out the legal framework for labor disputes, that had been written assuming all parties had pact standing, and that required only small and precise adjustments in language to apply equally to those who did not. The panel was not enthusiastic. The panel was for people who looked at Mara the way people look at something that has been placed in a room by someone more powerful than them and which they would very much like to remove but cannot. They were polite to her with the particular politeness of people who are doing something they find disagreeable and would like credit for the effort. She was polite back. She asked clear questions, stated the legal arguments without embellishment, and left the panel members with the paperwork in good order and no procedural angle from which to refuse without creating a problem larger than the one they were trying to avoid. Petra's case was decided in her favor 6 weeks after Mara first walked through the door. Felix was next. 19 years old, turned away from the King's Training Hall twice in 2 years for lack of a PAC endorsement. He had the physical requirements. He had tested above the minimum threshold in every category. The clerk at the admission desk had told him both times to return when his situation changed, which both of them had understood was a polite way of saying that the door was not going to open. Mara went to the training hall and spoke to the head instructor, a woman named Odin who had been running the hall for 23 years and who had a reputation for fairness and a limited patience for arguments that wasted her time. Mara did not waste her time. She laid out Felix's testing scores, his physical record, and the specific language in the training hall charter that tied endorsement requirements to a procedural policy document rather than to the hall's founding charter, which meant that the endorsement requirement existed because of internal policy rather than because of any law, which meant that an exception could be made by decision of the head instructor without requiring any external approval. Odin looked at the documents, looked at Mara, looked at the documents again, and said she would review the case. 2 weeks later Felix received a letter. He started at the training hall on the first day of the following month. Nell was harder to find. She was 12 years old, and she had learned, the way children learn when the adults who were supposed to protect them are gone, to stay in the places where adults were not looking. She had been surviving in the market district for 2 months before one of the market vendors, a woman who sold fabric and who had noticed the girl appearing and disappearing around the edges of her store, mentioned her to a neighborhood council member, who mentioned her to an administrator, who mentioned her to Mara's new office, which had a small sign on the door and 2 weeks of established existence and was the only place in the kingdom where such a mention would have gone anywhere. Mara found Nell on a cold morning sitting behind a stack of old crates near the eastern market gate. The girl was not frightened when Mara came around the corner and found her there. She looked at Mara with the flat, assessing look of someone who has learned to evaluate threats quickly and act on that evaluation faster. She was not small for her age. She was small for anyone's age, but her eyes were the eyes of someone who had been paying very close attention for a very long time. "I am not going to move you somewhere worse," Mara said. She did not crouch down to be at the girl's level. That had always seemed to her like a form of pretending, and this child did not deserve pretending. "I am going to find somewhere better. That will take a few days. Until then I would like to know where you sleep," Nell told her. It was not warm and it was not safe, but it was not as bad as it could have been, and Nell knew the difference. 3 weeks later Nell was with a family in the 4th district, PAC bonded, which extended protection to her under the new language Mara had pushed through in the September amendment to the Residency Protections document. She was in school. The teacher sent a note after the first month. The note said Nell asked more questions than anyone else in the class. Mara read that note standing at her table and then set it down and went to the window and stood there for a moment looking out at the training yard below. She met with the council 3 times in the first month. The council was for people who had the specific quality of politeness that people produce when they are being polite to someone they resent having to be polite to, and they were very polite to Mara, which told her a great deal about how they felt about the position and her occupancy of it. She was polite back. She asked clear questions. She took careful notes. She did not apologize for her presence and she did not make her questions smaller than they needed to be. She left each meeting knowing more than she had arrived with, which was the only standard she had decided to apply. The work grew. She had not expected how quickly it would grow, or how varied it would be. She had imagined it as a single kind of problem repeated in different specific forms, the same structural gap in the law showing up in the lives of different people. And that was partly true. But the problems were also different from each other in ways that required different approaches, different documents, different conversations with different officials who had different reasons for not wanting to engage. There was a man named Duncan, 51 years old, who had been farming a small piece of land on the western edge of the 3rd District for 18 years. He had built the farmhouse himself, had dug the well himself, had cleared the field himself over the course of 3 hard winters. He had no park affiliation and therefore no legal claim to the land he had worked for nearly 2 decades. A park household had decided they wanted the land. Under the current structure, there was no legal barrier to simply taking it, because the land had never been formally registered to Duncan because unbound people had no mechanism for formal registration of anything. Mara spent 2 weeks in the archive reading the land tenure documents from the previous 3 administrative periods before she found the provision she needed. It was a provision relating to continuous occupancy rights that had been written into the foundational land charter, a provision that predated the park structure itself, that had never been explicitly repealed because it had simply been forgotten, buried under 3 generations of subsequent documents that assumed park affiliation as a prerequisite for everything. She brought it to the land registry office on a Tuesday morning. The registrar looked at her. He looked at the document. He looked at her again. He said he would need to review the matter. She said she would return on Thursday. She returned on Thursday. Duncan's occupancy was formally registered by Friday afternoon. There was a young woman named Prue, 23, who had been refused treatment at the district medical house because she had no park to co-sign the treatment approval. She had a fever that had been going on for 11 days. The medical house rules required co-signature from a park elder to authorize any treatment beyond basic care. This was a policy document, not a law, and policy documents could be overridden by direct administrative approval from an official with sufficient rank. Mara went to the medical house on the morning she learned about Prue and spoke to the physician on duty, a careful, competent woman named Doris who had clearly been uncomfortable with the rule for some time and was grateful to have a senior official present who could sign the override authorization on the spot. Prue received treatment that afternoon. She recovered completely. She came to Mara's office 3 weeks later to say so, and Mara sat with her for an hour and wrote down everything Prue knew about how the medical house rules worked in practice, because that information was going to be useful. There was an entire settlement of unbound people, perhaps 40 adults and their children, living in a cluster of repurposed buildings on the northern edge of the city, technically outside the administrative boundary that made them eligible for any city services, water provision, road maintenance, waste collection. They had been there for 15 years. No one had made an active decision to exclude them from city services. No one had made an active decision to include them either. They simply existed in the gap between what the city's administrative maps covered and what they did not. Mara spent 3 weeks negotiating with 4 different departments before the settlement was formally incorporated into the city's administrative boundary. The department heads were not enthusiastic. 2 of them were genuinely obstructive. She outwaited them. She was very good at waiting. She kept a separate record now for each case, a folder of documents and notes and the specific language of the decisions that were made, because she had understood early on that the decisions themselves were not the most important part. The most important part was the precedent. Each decision, if it was worded correctly, was a door that the next case could use. Petra's case had been worded correctly. It had already been cited in 2 subsequent wage cases, neither of which had required her to appear in person because the precedent was now in the record and the adjudication panel could apply it directly. Felix's training hall admission had established that the endorsement requirement at the hall was procedural rather than legal, which meant that 2 other young men with similar situations had been able to apply under the same interpretation without coming to her office at all. This was the thing she had not fully understood when she said yes to the position. She had understood it as a personal role, herself as an individual with standing going into rooms on behalf of individuals without it. She had not understood that it was also a structural project. Each case was not only a case. It was a piece of the architecture of the next case, and the one after that. She began writing up the decisions not as simple records but as documents that could be used directly, that laid out the legal argument and the precedent in language clear enough that any literate person with access to them could follow the same path without her. She put them in the administrative archive, cross-indexed by type and by the specific provision they relied on. The archivist looked at the cross-index with an expression of mild surprise and then fired it properly. Small work. Patient work. The kind of work that does not look like much from the outside and that changes the shape of a place over time so gradually that by the time anyone notices, the shape has already changed. She saw Kellen in corridors, in the main hall during morning reports, in the courtyard on the occasional morning when she was working there. He would look at her with the organizing information expression and she would nod and he would nod and they would continue in their separate directions. Once, passing in the east corridor, he stopped and said, "How is it going?" And she said, 14 so far, and he said, "That is more than I expected in the first month," and she said, "There are more," and he looked at her for a moment and continued down the corridor. She thought about that conversation for the rest of the day, turning it over in a way that was warm and also somewhat irritating, and she did not examine why it was irritating, because that seemed like a question for later. She went to her room that evening and stood at the lamp with her hand in its light. The lamp threw its yellow glow across the floor around her feet. Bare stone. Clean light. No shadow. She had stopped finding it shocking. It was simply true now, the way many things were simply true. Her list of names was true. The draft through the mortar crack was true. The smell of pine at night was true. She moved her hand slowly through the lamplight, watching the light behave the way it behaved with any object, bending slightly around her fingers, redirecting, doing what light does when it finds something in its way. And then continuing past. Finding the flaw. Finding nothing where her shadow should have been. She thought, not for the first time, about what Seraphine had said. You will be, in that particular way, incomplete. Permanently and without remedy. She had turned those words over many times in the months since the dungeon. She had looked at them from different angles, trying to find the part of them that was wrong, that missed something, that had underestimated her. She had not found that part. The words were accurate. She was incomplete in the specific way Seraphine had named, and that incompleteness was permanent, and there was no remedy for it. These things were true simultaneously with other things that were also true, that she had chosen this, that she would choose it again, that the choice had purchased something worth purchasing, that she was building something with what remained of her and it was good work and it was working. She had learned, in these months, that a person could be simultaneously reduced and expanded. That you could lose something permanently and also become, in the same passage of time, more than you were before. She was not sure the two things were related. She was not sure they were not. She had decided it did not matter whether they were related. What mattered was that both were true. She took her hand out of the lamplight. She got her notes from the table. She sat down and kept working. That was 3 months in. That was how she knew she was going to be all right. Knowing that she was going to be all right did not mean every day was easy. There were mornings when she woke up and the first thing she saw was her hand on the blanket with the morning light on it and the floor beside the bed without any shadow, and for just a moment, the half second before full waking, she would reach for it automatically, the way you reach for a thing that has always been there, the way your hand moves towards something that is not where it used to be. The moment always passed. The full waking always arrived. She always went on. There were also evenings, sometimes, when she came back to her room after a day that had been difficult, a day when the counsel had been particularly obstructive or a case had hit a wall she had not anticipated, when she sat on the ledge of her window and looked at the training yard below and thought about all the things that were still wrong in this kingdom, all the names she had not yet reached, all the gaps she had not yet found the right language to close. On those evenings the absence below her feet felt heavier than on other evenings. Not more painful. Heavier. The way the weight of a decision can shift depending on whether you are tired or rested, whether the day has been good or hard. On those evenings she would look at the crack in the mortar above the window for a while. The crack was always there. The draft was always cold. The smell was always pine. These things had become anchors in a way she had not expected when she first noticed them. Small, certain, hers. She always went back to the table. She always kept walking. That was 3 months in. That was how she knew she was going to be all right. 6 months after the night the dungeon went dark, Mara was standing in the north courtyard on an early winter morning with a report in both hands, squinting slightly at the low angle of the sun. The winter light came in sharp and level and threw long clean shadows across everything it touched, across the stones and the walls and the people moving through the courtyard on their ordinary morning business. She was reading the adjudication language for Petra's final settlement, checking the figures, making sure the numbers matched what had been agreed. She heard his footsteps from across the courtyard. She knew them clearly now. Measured, even, unhurried. She had not noticed the specific moment when she began to know them, only that she did. It had been gradual, the way most true things are gradual, arriving not as a moment of recognition but as a slow accumulation of mornings and corridors and brief exchanges until one day the knowledge was simply there, complete, as if it had always been. She kept her eyes on the report. She finished the line she was reading. She let him cross the courtyard at his own pace, which was always the same pace, the pace of a man who had never found a reason to hurry toward anything. He came to stand beside her. Not in front of her. Beside her, looking out at the same courtyard she was looking at. He did this sometimes now, came to where she was rather than calling her to where he was. She had not commented on it. She had not been sure there was anything to comment on. She had filed it instead under the category of things she was simply noticing, things she was keeping track of without yet knowing what the tracking was for. She realized, standing here in the cold winter light with his footsteps arrived and the courtyard in front of them both, that she knew what the tracking was for. She had probably known for longer than she had acknowledged. She held the report so he could see it. She held the report so he could see it. Petra's final settlement came through this morning, she said. 6 years of unpaid wages, paid in full within the 30-day window. The household also provided the reference as required. She has already been approached about 2 positions with terms she finds acceptable. Good, he said. Felix is 6 weeks into training. His instructor sent a note. The phrase she used was startlingly prepared for someone who has had no formal access to the hall's resources. Something moved across his face that was adjacent to amusement. Also good. Nell is doing well. Her teacher says she asks more questions than anyone else in the class. He was quiet for a moment. Good, he said, more quietly than the other times. She folded the report. They stood together in the winter light. Around them the courtyard was full of ordinary morning business, people moving in every direction, and every one of them cast a clean winter shadow on the old stones. She looked down at the ground around her feet. She did this without making it significant anymore, which was new. For months she had only looked when she was being deliberate about facing the fact. Now she just looked sometimes, the way you look at a familiar part of your life. Beside her feet, running across the courtyard stone, was his shadow. Clear. Dark. Precise. The shadow of a man standing in winter sunlight beside a woman who cast none. She looked at it. She was not precisely sad. She had decided long ago that sadness was not the right word for what she was, because sadness implies that the thing could have been different, and she had made this choice with open eyes and would make it again tomorrow and every day after, and you cannot be sad about something you would choose over and over without reservation. What she felt was something that did not have a word. Something made of permanence and clarity and the specific weight of a thing that is entirely true and entirely yours. She felt him look down too. The winter light moved across the courtyard and found both of them and moved on the way light moves, without opinion, finding everything there is and leaving it as it found it. She thought about Owen. She hoped he had found his daughter. She thought about the woman who had walked touching the wall. She thought about the father who had turned back twice before he finally moved. She thought about the boy who had gripped her wrist in the soft dungeon dark and whose name she still did not know and probably never would, and who was somewhere now, alive, building whatever life he was going to build, and that was enough. That was the whole point, that it was enough even when she would never know the details. She thought about the bracket on the south corridor wall. That same permanent dull black. She would never polish it clean. She had accepted this. She thought about Petro with her wages and her reference and her two acceptable positions to consider. She thought about Felix, startlingly prepared. She thought about Nell asking more questions than anyone else in the class. She thought about the crack in the mortar above her window and the pine smell that came through it at night, which she had decided she liked, which was a small and true thing, a thing that was only hers. His hand found hers. Not suddenly. Not in the way that moments are made dramatic. In the way that things happen when two people have been moving toward the same point from different directions and the distance between them has simply run out. His hand was warm against the cold morning air. His fingers found hers on the side nearest to him and closed there gently, not gripping, just present. She did not look at him. He did not look at her. They both looked out at the courtyard, at the stones and the shadows and the people going about their ordinary mornings, and the one clean absence that ran from her feet outward to where the light ended. She thought about what Seraphine had said that night in the dungeon. Not the technical parts. Not the mechanics of the binding. The one sentence at the end, said simply and without drama, after all the technical parts were done. You will be, in that particular way, incomplete for the rest of your life. She had thought about that sentence many times. She thought about it now, standing in the winter light with no shadow below her feet and his hand not yet in hers but the winter air between them carrying the quality that air carries when two people are standing in it together and are aware of each other in a way that has become specific. Incomplete. She had been turning the word over for 6 months. She had been examining it from different sides, looking for the angle at which it became something less than it was, something more manageable, a smaller fact. She had not found that angle. The word was accurate in the specific way that Seraphine's words had always been accurate, without softening, without accommodation. She was incomplete in that one way. She was going to be incomplete in that one way for the rest of her life, in all seasons, in all light, in every room she ever stood in. And she was also here. She was also standing in the north courtyard of the king's residence on an early winter morning with 33 names on her list and 12 more she had not yet reached and a seal in her pocket and a room that locked from the inside and a table large enough to spread papers across. She was also the person who had found Petra and found Felix and found Nell behind the crates near the Easter market gate with her flat assessing eyes and her willingness to be found if the person finding her seemed worth being found by. She was also the person who had woken up one morning 3 weeks ago and realized that she had slept through the night, completely, without waking, without the half-second reaching for what was not there. She had simply slept and then woken up and the morning had been the morning. She had sat on the edge of her bed and thought about that for a moment, the uncomplicated fact of a full night of sleep, and then she had gotten up and gone to the table and gotten back to work. She had begun to understand, the person who thought about a brief corridor conversation for the rest of a day and did not examine why. She thought about the evening he had come to the East Chamber, the third day. She thought about what he had asked her. Not whether she had done it, but why she had been the one willing. She had given him the smallest true piece of the answer and he had accepted it without pressing for the rest, which had been the right thing to do, and she had noticed that he had done the right thing with it. She had been thinking about that for 6 months. Not constantly. Not obsessively. Just in the way that you think about something that has settled somewhere in you and that comes up when you are standing in a certain kind of light or when the pine smell comes through the crack and the evening is quiet and the work is done for the day. Some things do not resolve. She had understood this for a long time, longer than she had understood most things. They settle. The way old buildings settle over centuries, still carrying the full weight of everything that has happened to them, changed by it, marked by it, and still standing. Still themselves. Still there. Her fingers closed around his. Not because anything had been restored. Not because the shadow was coming back. Not because the cost she had paid had become comfortable or the space below her feet in the light had filled in. Not because she had found the word for what she felt in the mornings when she looked at the floor. Not because the crack in the mortar had closed. Because it was morning. Because there were more than 30 names on her list now and she had already identified 12 more she had not yet reached. Because she had a room that locked from the inside and a table large enough to work at and a window over the training yard and a lamp she could adjust. Because the pine smell came through the crack at night and she liked it. Because somewhere in the kingdom, in whatever lives they were building, in whatever time they had been given, the 11 people from the dungeon were alive and doing what alive people do, which is moving through the world with all its requirements and its ordinary days and its occasional unexpected pieces of light. She thought about Petra. She thought about Petra's face the morning the settlement was confirmed, not the expression of someone who had won something, but the expression of someone who had been returned something that had always been theirs, that had been taken from them so gradually and so early that they had almost stopped being able to remember having it. Not victory. Something older and quieter than victory. She thought about the moment she had spoken to Odin at the training hall and Odin had looked at Felix's scores and then looked at Mara with the specific expression of someone who has been wanting an excuse to do the right thing and has just been handed one. That expression. The gratitude in it was not for Mara specifically. It was for the existence of a door that had not been there before. She thought about Nell behind the crates, measuring her with those flat careful eyes, deciding in the space of about 4 seconds whether to speak or not to speak, and then speaking, which meant she had decided Mara was worth the risk. Nell was 12 years old and had been making that specific calculation, risk or no risk, for 2 months on her own. She was asking more questions than anyone else in the class. Mara had not been surprised by this at all. She thought about Duncan's farm and the provision in the foundational land charter that no one had thought to look for because no one had believed there was anything to find. She thought about the archivist's expression when she handed over the cross-index documents, mild surprise at the orderliness of it, and then the matter-of-fact way he had filed it, as if Mara had simply done a thing that needed doing and of course someone had done it. She thought about the 40 people in the settlement on the northern edge of the city, the settlement that had existed in the gap between administrative maps for 15 years, and the meeting she had attended with the 4 department heads, and the 2 who had been obstructive, and how she had outweighted them both, sitting in their offices with her notes and her seal and her willingness to return on Thursday and again on the following Monday if that was what was required, because she was very good at waiting and she had decided long ago that patience applied correctly was not a passive thing but an active one. She thought about the pile of precedent documents in the administrative archive, cross-indexed, organized, available. The doors she had made for the next person, and the one after that, and the one after that. She would not be there to open them every time. That was the point. That was what made it structural rather than personal, what made it last past the individual case and the individual person into the shape of the place itself. She thought about the boy from the dungeon, whose name she did not know, who was somewhere in the world right now in the morning light, and the morning light was falling around him the way it always does, and he had a shadow, and the shadow was his, and that was as it should be. She thought about her own hands. She looked at them briefly, the hand held and the hand at her side. Both of them hers. Both of them present. Both of them warm enough, despite the cold morning air. They had not asked for her name the night she helped them leave. She had not offered it. They were building lives they did not know had been purchased with something permanent, and that was how it should be. A bargain that requires the other person to know about it is not a real bargain. It is a transaction. What she had made was something else. The difference mattered to her. She did not need the 11 people from the dungeon to know her name. She did not need Petra to understand the full shape of what had made the position possible, or Felix to know the night it had started, or Nell to carry any awareness of it at all. They were free to live without that weight. That was the whole point. That was what she had bought with the iron thread and Seraphine's small dark pin and the piece of herself that now lay in the stone of the dungeon floor, permanent and unrecoverable, keeping the darkness available, keeping the shape of a door open even in the absence of those who had walked through it. The morning continued. The courtyard continued. The shadows moved with the sun the way shadows do, shortening as the sun climbed, sharpening as the light grew stronger, marking the progress of the day across the old stones with their patient, reliable geometry. And Mara stood in her clean particular absence and held the hand beside her and felt the cold air on her face and the warmth of his hand and the weight of the work still ahead and the weight of the work already done, and they were not in balance exactly, they were never going to be in balance, that was not the kind of thing that balanced. They were both simply true. Hand in his. Light on the courtyard. The shadows of everyone else lying clean and precise across the old stone. And the one clean absence that was hers. She breathed in. She breathed out. The day continued. So did she.